Hannah Brooks stared at the rusted toolbox welded to her father's pickup truck, her hands trembling as she pried it open with a crowbar. What she found inside wasn't just old tools, it was a collection of military medals, classified blueprints, and journals that revealed her father had been living a double life for 40 years. The man her family dismissed as a simple auto mechanic had actually been one of the most important wartime engineers of his generation. And the contents of that toolbox were about to make Hannah the most sought-after person in the historical community. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of the reading started like any other disappointment in Hannah Brooks's 28-year-old life. She sat in the cramped waiting room of Whitmore & Associates, the family law firm that had been handling the Brooks family affairs for 3 decades, watching her relatives whisper among themselves about what they expected to inherit from her recently deceased father, Frank Brooks. Her uncle Raymond adjusted his expensive watch and leaned toward her Aunt Patricia, speaking in hushed tones about the valuable properties Frank might have owned. Her cousin Derek scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing up to smirk at Hannah's grease-stained work clothes and steel-toed boots. Hannah had driven straight from Morrison's Auto Repair, where she worked as one of only 2 female mechanics in the entire county. Her fingernails still carried traces of motor oil, and her dark hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she wore every day. She knew what her family thought of her, the tomboy who had chosen to work with her hands instead of pursuing a college degree like her cousins. Frank had been the only one who understood her passion for engines and machinery, spending countless hours in his garage, teaching her the difference between a carburetor and a fuel injector when she was just 10 years in Bala. Old. Attorney Harold Whitmore entered the room with a manila folder tucked under his arm, his gray hair perfectly combed and his suit pressed to perfection. He had known Frank Brooks since the 1970s, but even he seemed surprised by the contents of the will he was about to read. The family settled into their chairs, Raymond straightening his tie, and Patricia smoothing her dress, as if preparing for a formal photograph. "The last will and testament of Franklin David Brooks," Whitmore began, his voice carrying the weight of legal formality. "To my brother Raymond, I leave my collection of vintage records in the antique desk that belonged to our father." Raymond nodded approvingly, already calculating the potential resale value of the items. "To my sister-in-law Patricia, I leave the china set and silverware that belonged to my late wife, hoping they will bring you the same joy they brought to our family dinners." Patricia pressed her lips together in a thin smile, clearly hoping for something more substantial. "To my nephew Derek, I leave my fishing equipment and the small boat currently stored at Miller's Marina." Derek looked up from his phone with genuine interest for the first time all morning, mentally planning weekend trips to the lake. The room fell silent as Whitmore turned to the final page of the will. Hannah felt every pair of eyes in the room focus on her, waiting to hear what valuable inheritance the family patriarch had left to his beloved daughter. "To my daughter Hannah, I leave my 1987 Ford pickup truck, currently parked behind Morrison's Auto Repair, along with all tools and equipment contained within." Whitmore's voice carried a note of finality that made Hannah's heart sink into her stomach. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Derek burst into laughter. "A beat-up truck? That's it? That old piece of junk isn't worth $500 on its best day." Raymond shook his head in dismay, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Hannah, I'm so sorry. Your father must have been more confused in his final months than we realized. That truck has been sitting in the same spot for over a decade, rusting away." Patricia leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering devastating news. "Honey, I saw their truck last week when I drove past the repair shop. The paint is peeling, the tires are flat, and there are weeds growing around the wheel wells. It's practically scrap metal." Hannah felt heat rising in her cheeks as her family continued to express their shock and pity over her meager inheritance. She had expected this reaction, but hearing it out loud still stunned like a physical blow. Her father had always been a simple man, working as a mechanic at various shops throughout his career, before finally settling into semi-retirement at Morrison's. She had assumed there wasn't much wealth to distribute, but receiving nothing more than an old truck felt like a cruel joke. "There must be some mistake," Derek continued, his laughter becoming more pronounced. Uncle Frank always said Hannah was his pride and joy. Surely he would have left her something more valuable than a vehicle that probably doesn't even run. Whitmore cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with the family's reaction. I can assure you there's no mistake. Mr. Brooks was very specific about these bequests, and he was of sound mind when he signed this will 6 months ago. The attorney's words carried an odd emphasis that Hannah couldn't quite interpret, as if he knew something the family didn't understand. She studied his expression, noting the way his eyes lingered on her face, as if he wanted to say more, but was bound by professional constraints. "Well," Raymond announced as he stood from his chair, "I suppose that settles everything. Hannah, you're welcome to have the truck towed to a scrapyard if you can't get it running. Mike did $50 for the metal." The family began gathering their belongings and making plans to collect their inheritances, their conversations already moving on to other topics. Hannah remained seated, staring at the copy of the will that Whitmore had handed to her. The words seemed to blur together as she tried to process the reality of her situation. "Miss Brooks," Whitmore said quietly, as the others filed out of the office. "Your father asked me to give you this when you were alone." He reached into his desk drawer and produced a small brass key attached to a worn leather keychain. "He said you would know what it opens when the time came." Hannah took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. The metal was warm and smooth, polished by decades of handling. The leather keychain bore her father's initials, carved in his own careful handwriting. She had seen him carrying this key countless times throughout her childhood, always keeping it in his front pocket like a talisman. "Did he say anything else about it?" she asked, but Whitmore was already shaking his head. "Only that you were smarter than anyone gave you credit for, and that you would understand his choices when you had all the information." The attorney's voice carried a note of genuine respect that surprised Hannah. "Your father was a remarkable man, Miss Brooks. I hope you'll remember that in the days to come." Hannah left the law office feeling more confused than ever. She drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook, past the diner where she and her father used to share breakfast every Sunday morning, past the library where he had encouraged her to read books about engineering and mathematics when other girls her age were reading romance novels. The key felt like a burning ember in her pocket, demanding attention she wasn't ready to give. Morrison's Auto Repair occupied a corner lot that had seen better days, but owner Bill Morrison had always treated Hannah fairly and respected her skills with engines. She pulled into the employee parking area and immediately spotted her father's truck, sitting exactly where it had been for the past year. The 1987 Ford F-150 had once been cherry red, but time and weather had faded the paint to a dull rust color that matched the actual rust eating away at the wheel wells and bumper. Hannah approached the vehicle slowly, seeing it with new eyes now that it officially belonged to her. The truck was indeed in poor condition, with flat tires, a cracked windshield, and dents along the passenger side where her father had scraped against a concrete post years earlier. Weeds had grown up around the wheels, and a family of sparrows had built a nest in the gap between the hood and the windshield frame. But as Hannah walked around to the truck bed, she noticed something her family had missed during their casual observations. The standard truck bed had been modified with a custom-built toolbox that ran the entire width of the vehicle. The box was made of heavy steel and had been welded directly to the truck frame, making it a permanent part of the vehicle's structure. What caught her attention most was the heavy-duty lock securing the toolbox, a lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything a simple mechanic would need for basic tools. Hannah pulled the brass key from her pocket and approached the toolbox with growing curiosity. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click, turning smoothly despite its age. The toolbox lid was heavier than she expected, requiring both hands to lift it fully open. What she found inside took her breath away. The toolbox was divided into several compartments, each carefully organized and protected by custom-fitted foam padding. The first section contained tools, but these weren't the standard wrenches and screwdrivers she had expected. Instead, she found precision instruments that looked more suitable for laboratory work than automotive repair. Calipers marked with measurements down to thousandths of an inch, specialized cutting tools made from materials she couldn't identify, and electronic testing equipment that appeared far more advanced than anything currently available in commercial markets. The second compartment contained something even more surprising, a collection of military medals arranged in a custom display case. Hannah recognized a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, but there were others she had never seen before, including several that appeared to be foreign decorations. Beneath the medals lay a stack of official military documents, each bearing various classification stamps and signatures from high-ranking officials. But it was the third compartment that truly shocked her. Dozens of rolled blueprints were secured with rubber bands, their edges yellowed with age, but their contents still perfectly preserved. Hannah carefully unrolled the first blueprint and found herself staring at detailed engineering drawings for what appeared to be some kind of aircraft engine. The technical specifications were far beyond anything she had encountered in her automotive training, filled with calculations and measurements that would challenge even experienced aerospace engineers. Each blueprint bore the same signature in the bottom right corner: F.D. Brooks, Senior Engineer. The dates ranged from 1968 to 1985, covering nearly 2 decades of her father's life that she had known nothing about. Hannah's hands trembled as she reached for the final compartment, which contained a series of leather-bound journals. She opened the first journal to find her father's familiar handwriting, but instead of maintenance logs or repair notes, she discovered detailed entries about classified military projects. Asterisk. March 15, 1971. Completed initial testing on the Mk7 turbine modifications. The efficiency improvements exceeded all projections by 12%. Colonel Harrison was pleased with the results, but emphasized the critical nature of maintaining absolute security protocols. Hannah turned 6 today. Told Margaret I was working late at the shop again. Asterisk. The entry hit Hannah like a physical blow. Her father had been working on classified military projects while she was growing up, lying to her mother about where he spent his evenings and weekends. She flipped through more pages, finding similar entries that painted a picture of a man living 2 completely separate lives. Asterisk. June 3, 1974. The helicopter rotor modifications had been approved for field testing. General Morrison believes our design improvements could save hundreds of lives by improving aircraft survivability in combat situations. Hannah won first place in the science fair today with her project on simple machines. She has her grandfather's engineering mind. Asterisk, asterisk. November 20, 1978. Received word that the cargo aircraft hydraulic system we designed performed flawlessly during the Berlin crisis. Our modifications allowed the planes to operate in conditions that would have grounded conventional aircraft. Hannah told me today she wants to be a mechanic like her old man. If only she knew the half of it. Asterisk. Hannah continued reading, her understanding of her father's true life growing with each page. Frank Brooks hadn't been a simple auto mechanic. He had been a highly classified government contractor, working on critical military and aerospace projects that were so sensitive he couldn't even tell his own family about them. The auto repair work had been his cover story, a way to explain his mechanical knowledge and provide a legitimate source of income, while his real work remained hidden. The journals revealed that Frank had been recruited directly out of engineering school by military intelligence officers who recognized his exceptional talent for mechanical innovation. He had spent nearly 30 years working on projects that included aircraft engines, weapons systems, communications equipment, and even early computer technology. The truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile storage unit for decades of classified work that couldn't be kept in a traditional office or laboratory. As Hannah continued reading, she discovered that her father's work had been far more significant than even she was beginning to understand. One journal entry from 1979 mentioned a project called Operation Gearshift, which involved designing specialized machinery for covert operations behind enemy lines. Another entry from 1982 detailed his involvement in developing fuel efficiency improvements for military vehicles that were later adapted for civilian use. But it was a journal entry from 1984 that made Hannah sink to her knees beside the truck. Asterisk. April 8, 1984. The Department of Defense has officially classified all of my work under the highest security levels. Colonel Davis informed me that my contributions to national security had been so significant that my identity and involvement must remain classified indefinitely. I will receive no public recognition for my service, no official acknowledgement of my contributions, and no veterans benefits despite nearly 20 years of critical work. They're offering a substantial financial settlement in exchange for my continued silence, but the money means nothing compared to the knowledge that I can never tell Hannah about the work that has defined my entire adult life. Asterisk. The entry continued for several more paragraphs, detailing Frank's growing frustration with the secrecy that surrounded his life. He wrote about missing family dinners because of emergency projects, lying to his wife about business trips that were actually classified research assignments, and watching his daughter grow up while being unable to share his proudest professional achievements with her. Hannah found herself crying as she read her father's words, finally understanding the distant look that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. She had always wondered why such a brilliant mechanic was content to work in small auto repair shops instead of pursuing opportunities with major automotive companies. Now she realized that he had already achieved far more than she could have imagined, but was bound by secrecy agreements that prevented him from ever receiving credit for his work. The final journal was different from the others, written in her father's more recent handwriting, and clearly intended for Hannah to find after his death. Asterisk, my dear Hannah. Asterisk, the first entry began. Asterisk, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have inherited more than just an old truck. The key I asked Whitmore to give you opens more than just a toolbox. It opens the door to understanding who I really was, and why I made the choices I made throughout your life. Asterisk, asterisk. I know the family laughed at your inheritance today. I know they think I left you nothing more than scrap metal and disappointment. But you are holding the evidence of work that helped shape the modern world, designs and innovations that are still classified decades after their creation. The truck itself was specially modified by military contractors to serve as a mobile research unit, complete with hidden compartments and security features that most people would never notice. Asterisk. Asterisk. I left these materials to you because you inherited more than just my love of mechanics. You inherited my engineering mind and my ability to see possibilities where others see only problems. The blueprints in this collection represent solutions to challenges that modern engineers are still struggling to solve. Some of the designs are for technologies that won't be commercially viable for another 20 or 30 years. Asterisk. Hannah wiped her eyes and continued reading, her father's voice seeming to speak directly to her through his carefully chosen words. Asterisk. I need you to understand that everything I did was classified under the highest levels of government security. Even now, 40 years later, much of this work remains sensitive. I have spent the last 5 years of my life carefully documenting everything in a way that protects national security while preserving the historical record of contributions that deserve to be acknowledged. Asterisk. Asterisk. There are people who have been searching for this collection for decades. Historians and researchers who suspected that critical military innovations from the Cold War era had been developed by classified contractors whose identities were never revealed. The Defense Department has loosened some classification restrictions in recent years, and several of my former colleagues have begun receiving recognition for their contributions to national security. Asterisk. Asterisk. What you have inherited is not just my life's work, but proof of innovations that influenced everything from commercial aviation to automotive fuel efficiency to computer technology. These designs and the story behind them belong in the Smithsonian Institution, not hidden in a toolbox behind an auto repair shop. Asterisk. The journal entry continued with specific instructions about how Hannah should proceed with her discovery. Frank had compiled a list of historians, researchers, and museum curators who would understand the significance of his work and help ensure that it received appropriate recognition. He had also included contact information for several of his surviving colleagues who could verify the authenticity and importance of the collection. But most importantly, Frank had written a detailed explanation of how Hannah could use her inheritance to build a better life for herself. Several of the designs in the collection contained innovations that could be adapted for civilian use, potentially leading to lucrative patents or consulting opportunities. He had even researched the legal process for declassifying certain technologies and making them available for commercial development. Asterisk. You have always been smarter and more capable than anyone in our family gave you credit for. Asterisk. Frank wrote in his final entry. Asterisk. This collection represents your opportunity to prove that intelligence and determination matter more than fancy degrees or family connections. Use what I have left you to build something remarkable, and never let anyone make you feel small again. Asterisk. Hannah closed the journal and sat in stunned silence beside the truck. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the repair shop parking lot. She felt as if the entire foundation of her understanding about her father and her family had shifted beneath her feet. The man she thought she knew had been living a completely different life, making contributions to national security that were so significant they remained classified decades later. But more than that, Hannah realized that her father had seen potential in her that she had never recognized in herself. He hadn't left her a worthless truck out of oversight or confusion. He had left her a treasure trove of knowledge and opportunity that could change the entire trajectory of her life. She carefully returned all of the materials to their proper compartments in the toolbox and locked it securely. The key felt different in her hand now, heavier with the weight of responsibility and possibility. As she walked toward the repair shop's office, Hannah found herself standing straighter, her mind already racing with plans for what she needed to do next. Bill Morrison looked up from his paperwork as Hannah entered the office. He was a good man in his 60s who had given Hannah her first real opportunity in the automotive industry. But she could see the sympathy in his eyes as he prepared to console her about her disappointing inheritance. "Hannah, I heard about the will reading today," he began carefully. "I want you to know that you're welcome to park that old truck here as long as you need to figure out what to do with it." "Actually, Bill, I need to ask you for some time off," Hannah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have some research to do, and I might need to travel out of state for a few weeks." Morrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. Hannah had never asked for extended time off in the 3 years she had worked for him. "Is everything all right? If you need help dealing with the truck, I know a guy who can tow it to the salvage yard for a reasonable price." Hannah smiled, feeling a surge of confidence that surprised her. "The truck is going to be just fine, Bill. Better than fine, actually. I'm going to prove that my father left me something far more valuable than anyone realizes." Over the next few days, Hannah began the process of verifying and documenting her father's collection. She started by contacting Dr. Rebecca Chen, a military historian at Georgetown University, whose name appeared on Frank's list of recommended contacts. Dr. Chen's initial skepticism quickly transformed into excitement as Hannah described the contents of the toolbox and provided photographs of key documents. "Miss Brooks, if what you're describing is authentic, you may have one of the most significant collections of classified Cold War engineering documents ever discovered by civilians," Dr. Chen explained during their phone conversation. "I've been researching unattributed military innovations from that era for over 15 years. There are dozens of technological advances that we know happened but have never been able to trace to their original boss, developers." Dr. Chen arranged to travel to Millbrook within the week, bringing along Dr. James Rodriguez, a specialist in declassified military technology from the Pentagon's Historical Research Division. Hannah spent the time before their arrival carefully studying her father's blueprints and journals, beginning to understand the scope of his contributions to modern technology. When the historians arrived, Hannah led them to the truck with a mixture of pride and nervousness. She had moved the vehicle to a more secure location behind her apartment building and covered it with a tarp to prevent curious neighbors from investigating. As she unlocked the toolbox and revealed its contents, she watched Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez exchange meaningful glances. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Rodriguez murmured as he examined the military medals and official documents. "Your father worked on some of the most classified projects of the 1970s and 80s. These commendations are from operations that are still partially classified today." Dr. Chen was photographing the blueprints with practiced efficiency, occasionally stopping to make notes about specific technical details. "Hannah, some of these designs are for technologies that didn't become publicly known until the 1990s. Your father was working on innovations that were 20 years ahead of their time." As the examination continued, Hannah learned that her father's work had influenced far more aspects of modern life than she could have imagined. His fuel efficiency improvements had been incorporated into civilian vehicles throughout the 1980s, contributing to the development of modern engine management systems. His aircraft modifications had improved the safety and performance of both military and commercial aviation. Even his work on computer interfaces had played a role in the development of early personal computer technology. But perhaps most significantly, several of Frank's innovations had been adapted for civilian use without any public acknowledgement of his contributions. Companies had made millions of dollars from technologies that originated in his classified research, while Frank himself had received only modest contractor payments and been sworn to secrecy about his role in Sachene. Their development. Your father deserves recognition not just as a skilled engineer, but as one of the unsung heroes of American technological development, Dr. Chen explained as they concluded their examination. This collection represents a missing piece of Cold War history that historians have been trying to reconstruct for decades. Dr. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. More importantly, from a legal standpoint, the classification restrictions on much of this work have been lifted in recent years. Your father's contributions can now be acknowledged publicly, and there may be significant financial benefits available to his estate. End quote. The historians explained that several government programs had been established to provide retroactive recognition and compensation to classified contractors whose work had contributed to national security. Frank's collection provided the documentation necessary to prove his involvement in projects that had generated billions of dollars in technological advances. But Hannah was also learning that her discovery had attracted attention from less welcome sources. Within days of the historian's visit, she began receiving phone calls from private collectors and antiquities dealers who had somehow learned about the existence of her father's materials. The calls started politely, with offers to purchase individual items from the collection, but quickly became more aggressive as Hannah consistently declined to sell anything. One caller, who identified himself as Marcus Webb from Historical Acquisitions Limited, was particularly persistent. "Miss Brooks, you need to understand that you're in possession of materials that have significant value to the right collectors. We're prepared to offer you $250,000 for the entire contents of that toolbox." No questions asked. Hannah had done enough research by this point to know that Webb's offer, while substantial, represented a fraction of the collection's true value. More concerning was the fact that she had never publicly announced her discovery or provided any details about the collection's contents. The speed with which these dealers had located her suggested that someone was monitoring her activities. "I'm not interested in selling," Hannah replied firmly. "These materials belong to my father, and they're going to be donated to appropriate historical institutions where they can be properly studied and displayed." Webb's tone became noticeably colder. "Miss Brooks, I think you're making a mistake. Items like this have a way of disappearing if they're not properly secured. It would be unfortunate if something happened to your father's legacy because you were too stubborn to accept a rasa." Generous offer. The implied threat was clear enough to make Hannah uncomfortable, but it also strengthened her resolve to see her father's story told properly. She contacted local police to report the harassing phone calls and began working with Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez to expedite the process of getting the collection into secure institutional custody. Meanwhile, Hannah's family was beginning to hear rumors about her activities. Derek had driven past her apartment building and noticed the covered truck, along with the official government vehicles that had been parked nearby during the historian's visits. Her uncle Raymond called her directly, his voice carrying barely concealed anger. "Hannah, we're hearing some very strange stories about that old truck of Frank's," Raymond began without preamble. "People are saying you've been meeting with government officials and that there might be something valuable hidden in it after all." Hannah had been dreading this conversation, but she was better prepared for it than her uncle expected. "There are some historically significant items that belong to Dad, yes. I'm working with historians to make sure they're properly preserved and studied." "Historically significant?" Raymond's voice rose in indignation. "What could your father possibly have owned that would interest historians? He was a mechanic, Hannah. He fixed cars for a living. Dad was more than just a mechanic, Uncle Raymond. Much more than any of us knew." Hannah's voice carried a new confidence that surprised even her. "He made contributions to this country that deserved recognition decades ago. I'm just making sure he finally gets credit for his work." The conversation escalated quickly, with Raymond demanding to know exactly what Hannah had found and asserting that any valuable discoveries should be shared equally among all family members. When Hannah politely but firmly refused to provide details or consider selling the collection, Raymond threatened to take legal action to contest Frank's will. "You can try," Hannah replied calmly. "But Dad's will was very specific, and everything I found was clearly intended for me. The lawyers and historians I'm working with have confirmed that I have full legal ownership of all materials." After ending the call, Hannah realized that she needed to accelerate her timeline for getting the collection into secure custody. The combination of aggressive collectors and family pressure was creating a situation that could become dangerous if not handled carefully. Dr. Chan arranged for the Smithsonian Institution to take temporary custody of the most sensitive materials, while a full authentication and cataloging process was completed. The transfer took place under security protocols normally reserved for priceless artifacts, with armed guards overseeing the movement of Frank's blueprints and documents to climate-controlled storage facilities in Washington, D.C. But Hannah insisted on keeping the truck itself, and some of the less sensitive materials, including several of her father's journals and a selection of his engineering tools. These items represented her personal connection to Frank's story, and she wanted to maintain some direct involvement in how his legacy was presented to the public. The authentication process took several months, during which Hannah continued working at Morrison's Auto Repair, while also collaborating with researchers and historians who were documenting her father's tile contributions. She discovered that she had inherited not just Frank's mechanical aptitude, but also his ability to understand complex engineering concepts and see connections between seemingly unrelated technologies. Dr. Chen invited Hannah to participate in writing several academic papers about Frank's work. Recognizing that her insights as both his daughter and a practicing mechanic provided unique perspectives on his innovations, Hannah found herself traveling to conferences and symposiums, presenting research alongside PhD holders and military historians who treated her as an equal colleague rather than just the mechanic's daughter who had stumbled onto something important. The first major public recognition of Frank's work came when the Smithsonian announced a special exhibition titled Hidden Heroes, Classified Contractors of the Cold War. Frank Brooks was featured prominently, with his innovations displayed alongside those of other engineers whose contributions had remained secret for decades. Hannah attended the opening ceremony, wearing the first dress she had owned since high school and carrying the brass key that had unlocked her father's secrets. Standing in front of the display case that contained Frank's medals and blueprints, Hannah was approached by an elderly man in a military dress uniform covered with decorations. He introduced himself as General Patricia Morrison, retired, and explained that he had worked with Frank on several classified projects during the 1970s. "Your father was one of the most brilliant engineers I ever had the privilege of working with," General Morrison told Hannah with evident emotion. "His innovations saved thousands of lives and gave our military technological advantages that helped end the Cold War years sooner than it might have otherwise. Frank deserved recognition decades ago, and I'm grateful that you've made it possible for his story to finally be told." The general's words were echoed by other attendees throughout the evening, including former military officers, aerospace engineers, and technology executives who had unknowingly benefited from Frank's innovations throughout their careers. Hannah realized that her father's influence extended far beyond the specific projects documented in his collection, inspiring other engineers and contributing to technological advances that continued to impact millions of lives. But the exhibition also attracted the attention of reporters and documentary filmmakers who were interested in telling Frank's story to a broader audience. Hannah found herself being interviewed by journalists from major newspapers and magazines, explaining how a small-town mechanic had managed to contribute so significantly to national security while maintaining complete secrecy about his work. One interview in particular stood out, conducted by investigative journalist Sarah Martinez for a major network news program. Martinez had spent months researching other classified contractors from the Cold War era, and she understood the broader historical context of Frank's work. "Hannah, your father's story represents something larger than just individual achievement," Martinez explained during their conversation. "It's about the thousands of ordinary Americans who made extraordinary contributions to national security during one of the most dangerous periods in our country's history. These people worked in secret, received no public recognition, and often sacrificed their personal relationships to serve their country. Your decision to preserve and share your father's legacy honors all of them." End quote. The network documentary about Frank's life aired 6 months after Hannah's initial discovery, reaching an audience of millions and generating renewed interest in the stories of other classified Cold War contractors. Hannah watched the program from her father's favorite chair in her apartment, surrounded by the engineering books and technical manuals he had left behind. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Hannah's discovery was the impact it had on her own life and career. The recognition of Frank's contributions led to substantial compensation from government programs designed to acknowledge classified contractors, providing Hannah with financial security for the first time. Her adult life. More importantly, her involvement in documenting and presenting his work had revealed her own talents for technical communication and historical research. Several major automotive companies had reached out to Hannah after learning about her background and her role in preserving her father's innovations. She received offers for engineering positions that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier, opportunities that recognized both her practical mechanical skills and her newly demonstrated abilities in research and binary analysis. Hannah ultimately accepted a position with Aerospace Dynamics Corporation as a historical technical consultant, working to identify and develop civilian applications for previously classified vessel technologies. The job allowed her to continue her father's work in a sense, bridging the gap between military innovations and commercial applications while ensuring that the engineers responsible for groundbreaking developments received appropriate recognition. She also established the Franklin Brooks Foundation, using a portion of the compensation she had received to provide scholarships for young women pursuing careers in mechanical engineering and aerospace technology. The Foundation's mission statement emphasized the importance of recognizing unsung contributions to technological progress and encouraging innovative thinking, regardless of traditional educational credentials. But Hannah never forgot the lesson her father had taught her through his final gift. The toolbox that had seemed like a cruel joke had actually been a carefully planned legacy, designed to reveal Frank's true story at a time when Hannah was mature enough to understand its significance and strong enough to handle the responsibilities that came with it. On the first anniversary of her discovery, Hannah drove the restored 1987 Ford pickup to Frank's gravesite. She had invested some of her compensation in having the truck professionally rebuilt, returning it to the cherry red color it had worn when her father first bought it. The custom toolbox remained welded to the bed, but now it contained new tools and equipment that Hannah used in her consulting work, continuing the tradition of mobile engineering that Frank had established decades earlier. Standing beside her father's headstone, Hannah placed a small bouquet of flowers and spoke aloud to him for the first time since his funeral. "I understand now, Dad. I understand why you made the choices you made, and why you trusted me with your secrets. You knew that I was stronger than anyone else believed, including myself. You knew that I would fight to tell your story properly and make sure you got the recognition you deserved." She paused, looking out across the cemetery, toward the town where she had grown up feeling like an outsider in her own family. "But most importantly, you knew that your story wasn't just about the past. It was about showing me that I could build something meaningful with my life. Something that honored both your legacy and my own potential. You didn't leave me a worthless truck, Dad. You left me the key to understanding that I was never worthless at all." As Hannah drove away from the cemetery, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning in the lawyer's office when her family had laughed at her inheritance. The same relatives who had pitied her now sought her attention and approval, suddenly recognizing her importance, now that her story had been featured in national media. But Hannah had learned that their opinion of her success mattered far less than her own understanding of her capabilities and worth. The brass key that had unlocked her father's toolbox now hung on a chain around her neck, serving as a constant reminder that the most valuable inheritances are often disguised as disappointments. Frank Brooks had given his daughter far more than military medals and classified blueprints. He had given her the knowledge that she possessed the intelligence, determination, and integrity necessary to build something remarkable from whatever materials life provided. Hannah's story became a symbol for other people who felt overlooked or underestimated by their families and communities. She received hundreds of letters from young women who were pursuing careers in male-dominated fields, from adult children who were discovering hidden aspects of their parents' lives, and from anyone who had ever felt that their potential was being dismissed by people who should have supported them. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other children of classified Cold War workers, people who had spent their lives wondering why their parents seemed distant or secretive about their professional lives. Hannah's willingness to share Frank's story had inspired a broader conversation about the personal costs of classified service and the importance of eventually acknowledging the contributions of those who served their country in secret. As Hannah settled into her new career and continued expanding her foundation's work, she often thought about the moment when she had first opened her father's toolbox. That instant of discovery had changed everything, revealing not just hidden history, but hidden possibilities within herself. The rusted truck that her family had mocked as worthless had actually been a carefully crafted gift, designed to transform Hannah's understanding of her own identity and potential. Frank Brooks had spent decades working in secrecy, creating innovations that influenced the modern world while receiving no public recognition for his contributions. But his greatest achievement wasn't any particular invention or technical breakthrough. His greatest achievement was raising a daughter who possessed the courage and intelligence necessary to ensure that his story would finally be told, and that his legacy would inspire others to recognize the extraordinary potential that often hides within ordinary circumstances. The female mechanic who had once been dismissed as inheriting nothing but junk had transformed into one of the most respected voices in Cold War historical research. Hannah's expertise was now sought by universities, government agencies, and technology companies around the world. She had proven that intelligence and determination could overcome any prejudice or limitation that others tried to impose. 3 years after opening the toolbox, Hannah stood before a packed auditorium at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, delivering the keynote address at the annual Conference on Declassified Military Technology. The audience included some of the most brilliant minds in engineering and historical research, all listening intently as she explained how her father's hidden work had influenced technologies they used every day. "My father once told me that the best engineers are those who can see possibilities where others see only problems," Hannah said, her voice carrying easily across the large hall. "When I inherited his truck, my family saw only rust and disappointment. But Frank Brooks had taught me to look deeper, to understand that the most valuable things are often hidden beneath unremarkable surfaces." She clicked to a slide showing the original photograph of the rusted pickup truck alongside a current image of the restored vehicle, now gleaming in its original cherry red paint. This truck carried secrets that helped shape the modern world, driven by a man whose contributions remained hidden for 40 years. But more than that, it carried a lesson about the importance of recognizing potential wherever it might be found, regardless of how it's initially presented or who others think deserves recognition. End quote. In the audience, Hannah spotted several familiar faces. Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez sat in the front row, beaming with pride at how far their initial collaboration had developed. General Morrison occupied a seat of honor, his uniform once again displaying the decorations he had earned working alongside Frank Brooks decades earlier. But perhaps most meaningful to Hannah were the faces of young women scattered throughout the auditorium. Engineering students and early career professionals who saw her as proof that their own potential couldn't be limited by other people's expectations. After her presentation, Hannah was approached by Dr. Margaret Foster, the head of MIT's Mechanical Engineering Department. Dr. Foster had been following Hannah's work since the first academic papers about Frank's contributions had been published, and she had a proposal that took Hannah completely by surprise. "Ms. Brooks, I'd like to offer you a position as a visiting professor in our department," Dr. Foster explained. "Your unique combination of practical experience, historical research skills, and technical communication abilities would be invaluable to our students. You could teach courses on the intersection of engineering history and modern innovation, helping the next generation understand how past breakthroughs inform current challenges." End quote. Hannah felt a familiar surge of disbelief, the same feeling she had experienced when opening her father's toolbox. The idea that she, a mechanic without a college degree, could teach at one of the world's most prestigious engineering schools, seemed impossible. But then she remembered Frank's words about seeing possibilities where others saw problems, and she realized that her unconventional background might actually be exactly what made her qualified for this opportunity. "I'd be honored to consider it," Hannah replied, her confidence growing with each word. "But I'd want to make sure that my courses emphasized practical application alongside theoretical knowledge. Some of the most important innovations come from people who understand how things actually work in the real world, not just how they look on paper." Dr. Foster smiled knowingly. "That's exactly why we want you, Hannah. Our students are brilliant theoretically, but many of them have never actually built anything with their own hands. You could teach them that engineering isn't just about calculations and computer models. It's about understanding materials and mechanisms at a fundamental level." As Hannah considered this new possibility, she thought about how Frank would have reacted to seeing his daughter offered a professorship at MIT. He had always encouraged her love of learning and her natural mechanical aptitude, but even he might have been surprised by how far those qualities had ultimately taken her. The position at MIT would require Hannah to relocate from Millbrook, leaving behind a small town where she had grown up feeling like an outsider. But she had learned that sometimes the most important growth comes from embracing change, rather than clinging to familiar circumstances, even when that change feels overwhelming. Before making her final decision, Hannah wanted to visit one more important place. She drove the restored pickup truck back to Morrison's Auto Repair, where her journey of discovery had begun. Bill Morrison was still working under the hood of a customer's car, his movements showing the careful precision of decades of experience. "Hannah!" Morrison called out as she parked the truck. "Look at you. All famous and successful. I saw you on that documentary about your dad. Never knew Frank was involved in all that classified stuff, but it explains why he always seemed to understand mechanical problems that stumped the rest of us." Hannah smiled, remembering her early days working alongside Morrison and learning the practical skills that had prepared her for everything that followed. "Bill, I wanted to thank you for giving me my start in this business. Everything that's happened since then has been built on what you taught me about working with my hands and solving problems." Morrison wiped his hands on a shop rag, his expression growing serious. "Hannah, what I taught you was just the basics. What you've accomplished since then, that came from inside you. Your dad would be proud as hell to see what you've made of the opportunities he gave you." They talked for another hour about Hannah's plans for the future, her potential move to MIT, and the continuing work of her foundation. Morrison expressed genuine pride in her achievements, but he also made it clear that she would always have a home at his shop if she ever wanted to return to simpler times. As Hannah prepared to leave, Morrison handed her a small wrapped package. "I found this in Frank's old workbench after he passed away. Figured you should have it now that you understand what he was really up to all those years." Hannah unwrapped the package to find a small framed photograph she had never seen before. It showed her father as a much younger man, wearing a military uniform, and standing alongside a group of other engineers in front of what appeared to be an experimental aircraft. Frank's expression in the photograph was confident and proud, completely different from the quiet, reserved man she had known growing up. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Project Aurora Team, 1976. These men changed aviation forever, but their names will never appear in history books. F.D. Brooks, lead engineer." The photograph provided one final piece of evidence for Frank's remarkable secret life. But more importantly, it showed Hannah a version of her father she had never been allowed to see. The man in the uniform looked like someone who knew exactly how important his work was, someone who took pride in his contributions, even though they had to remain hidden from the world. Hannah carefully placed the photograph in the truck's glove compartment, adding it to the collection of mementos that connected her to Frank's true story. As she drove toward home, she made her final decision about MIT's offer. She would accept the position, not because she needed to prove anything to her family or the world, but because teaching the next generation of engineers felt like a natural continuation of her father's work. Frank Brooks had spent his career solving problems in secret, creating innovations that influenced millions of lives, while receiving no recognition for his efforts. Hannah would spend her career helping young engineers understand that their work could have impacts far beyond what they initially imagined, and that the most important contributions often come from people who are willing to dedicate themselves to excellence, regardless of whether they receive credit for their efforts. The brass key around Hannah's neck caught the afternoon sunlight as she drove, reminding her once again that the most valuable inheritances are those that reveal hidden potential rather than material wealth. Her father had left her far more than blueprints and medals. He had left her a story that proved the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to discover the extraordinary possibilities that exist within ordinary circumstances. Hannah Brooks had inherited a rusty truck and used it to unlock a legacy that changed her life and inspired thousands of others. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned to see herself through her father's eyes, recognizing the intelligence, determination, and integrity that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The female mechanic who had once been mocked for her meager inheritance had become living proof that the most valuable gifts are often disguised as disappointments, and that true worth is measured not by what others think you deserve, but by what you're capable of achieving when you finally understand your own potential. 6 months into her tenure at MIT, Hannah discovered that teaching brilliant young minds presented challenges she had never anticipated. Her first semester course, Applied Engineering History, from Classified Innovation to Commercial Application, had attracted over 200 students, far more than the department had expected. The classroom assigned for the course couldn't accommodate the demand, forcing the administration to move her lectures to the largest auditorium on campus. Hannah's teaching style was unlike anything the students had experienced before. Rather than beginning with theoretical frameworks or historical timelines, she started each class by bringing in actual pieces of machinery, often components she had salvaged from junkyards or obtained from GER, military surplus dealers. Her first lecture began with her wheeling a 1970s aircraft engine into the auditorium, its metallic surfaces scarred by decades of use. This engine contains innovations that were classified for 20 years after their development, Hannah announced to the packed auditorium. The engineers who designed these modifications never received public credit for work that revolutionized both military and civilian aviation. Today we're going to take this engine apart piece by piece, and I'm going to show you exactly how unrecognized genius shaped the technology you take for granted." End quote. The students, many of whom had never touched an actual engine despite their advanced theoretical knowledge, watched in fascination as Hannah began disassembling the complex machinery with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years working with similar equipment, but her explanations revealed an understanding of engineering history that impressed even her faculty colleagues who had initially questioned her qualifications. "Notice the unusual configuration of these fuel injection ports," Hannah said, pointing to a section of the engine that looked unremarkable to untrained eyes. This design was developed by a classified contractor in 1974, specifically to improve fuel efficiency in military aircraft operating at extreme altitudes. The same principles were later incorporated into civilian engines, but the original developer never received patent credit because his work remained classified until 1998. End quote. She paused to make eye contact with students throughout the auditorium, ensuring that everyone understood the broader implications of what she was demonstrating. This is why understanding engineering history matters. Every component in this engine represents somebody's innovation, somebody's solution to a specific problem, but many of those somebodies were people whose contributions were deliberately hidden from the public record. When you graduate and begin your own careers, you need to understand that innovation often happens in the shadows, by people who may never receive recognition for their work. One student, a young woman named Jessica Park, who reminded Hannah of herself at that age, raised her hand. "Professor Brooks, how do we know which technologies have hidden histories like this? How can we identify innovations that deserve recognition but haven't received it?" Hannah smiled, recognizing the curiosity and determination in Jessica's voice. "That's exactly the right question to ask. The answer is that you have to develop an eye for engineering solutions that seem too advanced for their supposed time period, or technologies that appeared suddenly without clear development histories. You also have to be willing to dig deeper than the official story, to research the people behind the patents and publications, After the lecture, Jessica approached Hannah with additional questions about research methodologies and career paths for engineers interested in historical work. Their conversation reminded Hannah of her own father's encouragement of her mechanical interests, and she realized that teaching provided her with opportunities to mentor young people who might otherwise never discover their full potential. Jessica, if you're seriously interested in this field, I'd like to invite you to work with me on a research project, Hannah offered. I'm collaborating with several institutions to identify other classified contractors whose work deserves recognition. We need researchers who understand both engineering principles and historical investigation methods. Jessica's eyes lit up with excitement that was immediately familiar to Hannah. I'd love to be involved in something like that. I've always wondered about the stories behind the technologies we study, but none of my other professors seemed interested in those kinds of questions. This conversation marked the beginning of what would become Hannah's most important contribution to MIT, beyond her formal teaching duties. She began recruiting undergraduate and graduate students who shared her interest in uncovering hidden engineering histories, eventually establishing an informal research group that they dubbed the Anonymous Escher Innovators Project. The project's first major investigation focused on the development of early computer interface technologies during the 1980s. Hannah's students had noticed discrepancies between official development timelines and the sudden appearance of sophisticated user interface concepts that seemed too advanced for their supposed origins. Using research techniques Hannah had learned during her work with her father's collection, the team began identifying patterns that suggested significant classified work had influenced civilian computer development. Their investigation led them to contact dozens of retired engineers and military contractors from that era, many of whom had never been interviewed about their work because researchers hadn't known of their involvement in classified projects. The team's approach was methodical and respectful, focusing on documenting contributions rather than sensationalizing secrets, which helped them gain the trust of people who had remained silent for decades. One of their most significant discoveries involved the work of Maria Santos, a software engineer who had developed critical user interface innovations for military computer systems in the early 1980s. Santos had watched civilian companies make fortunes from technologies that were directly derived from her classified work, while she herself had received only modest contractor payments and been bound by secrecy agreements that prevented her from even listing the projects on her resume. I spent 15 years thinking that my career had been a failure, Santos explained during a video interview that Hannah's students conducted for their research. I had developed software that was years ahead of anything in the civilian market. But I couldn't talk about it or use it to advance my career. I watched less qualified men get promoted and recognized for work that wasn't nearly as innovative as what I was doing in secret. Santos's story became the centerpiece of a research paper that Hannah's students presented at the International Conference on Computing History. The paper not only documented Santos's contributions, but also provided a framework for identifying other hidden contributors to early computer technology development. The presentation received a standing ovation and was subsequently published in the Journal of Technology History, marking the first time undergraduate students from Hannah's program had achieved such prestigious recognition. But the success of the Anonymous Innovators Project also brought Hannah to the attention of powerful interests who preferred that certain histories remain hidden. Several months after the Santos paper was published, Hannah began receiving visits from individuals who claimed to represent various government agencies and private corporations. The first visitor was a man named David Richardson, who presented credentials indicating that he worked for the Department of Defense's Classification Review Office. Richardson was polite but firm in explaining that Hannah's research activities were approaching sensitive areas that could compromise ongoing national security interests. Professor Brooks, we appreciate your commitment to recognizing unsung contributors to technological development, Richardson said during their meeting in Hannah's MIT office. However, some of the research directions your students are pursuing could inadvertently expose information that remains classified for legitimate security reasons. Hannah listened carefully to Richardson's concerns, but she also noticed that his objections seemed more focused on protecting corporate interests than genuine security issues. Many of the technologies her students were investigating had been declassified years earlier, and their work focused on historical documentation rather than technical specifications that could compromise current EA capabilities. Mr. Richardson, I understand your concerns about security, but I'm not convinced that documenting the contributions of engineers like Maria Santos poses any genuine threat to national interests. Hannah replied. These people deserve recognition for their work, and their stories provide valuable insights into how innovation actually happens versus how it's officially recorded. Richardson's expression remained neutral, but Hannah detected a subtle shift in his tone that suggested her response had not satisfied his concerns. Professor Brooks, I hope you'll consider the broader implications of your research. Sometimes the desire to correct historical oversights can have unintended consequences that extend far beyond academic recognition. After Richardson left, Hannah felt a familiar combination of determination and apprehension that reminded her of the phone calls from aggressive collectors when she had first discovered her father's materials. She realized that her work was threatening entrenched interests that had profited from keeping certain innovations and their creators hidden from public view. Hannah decided to accelerate her research efforts rather than retreat from them. She reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in uncovering corporate and government misconduct, explaining the patterns her students had discovered and the resistance they were encountering from official BA. Sources. One journalist, Michael Torres from the Washington Herald, was particularly interested in the potential connections between classified military research and civilian technology patents. Professor Brooks, what you're describing sounds like a systematic pattern of appropriating innovations developed by classified contractors and repackaging them as corporate breakthroughs, Torres explained during their initial conversation. If that's accurate, it represents one of the largest cases of unacknowledged intellectual property transfer in modern history. Torres's investigation, conducted in collaboration with Hannah's research team, revealed that dozens of major technology patents had been filed by corporations using innovations that were originally developed by classified contractors who could never claim credit for their work. The financial value of these appropriated technologies was estimated in the billions of dollars, while the original developers had typically received only modest payments and been sworn to secrecy about their contributions. The Herald's exposé, published as a three-part series titled The Hidden Innovators: How Classified Research Became Corporate Gold, generated national attention and sparked congressional hearings about intellectual property rights for classified contractors. Hannah found herself testifying before a House subcommittee about her research findings and the need for better recognition and compensation systems for people whose work contributed to both national security and commercial development. During her testimony, Hannah was able to present her father's story as a representative example of the broader patterns her research had uncovered. Frank Brooks's innovations had influenced multiple industries while he received minimal compensation and no recognition, but his case was far from unique. The research conducted by Hannah's students had identified hundreds of similar cases spanning 5 decades of classified contract work. Members of the committee, Hannah addressed the panel of representatives. My father spent 30 years contributing to technologies that shaped the modern world, but he died believing that his work was too secret to ever be acknowledged. The materials he left me proved that his contributions deserved recognition decades ago, but more importantly, they revealed that his experience was part of a much larger pattern affecting thousands of other engineers and inventors. She paused to look directly at each committee member, drawing on the confidence she had developed through years of teaching and public speaking. We're not just talking about historical curiosity or academic recognition. We're talking about a systematic failure to acknowledge the contributions of people whose work generated enormous economic value while they themselves received only a tiny fraction of the benefits. This isn't just unfair to individual innovators. It's bad for American technological development because it discourages exactly the kind of creative thinking we need to maintain our competitive advantages." End quote. The congressional hearings led to the establishment of new programs for recognizing and compensating classified contractors, but they also intensified the pressure Hannah was receiving from interests that preferred the existing system. Her office at MIT was broken into twice, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Her home phone received late-night calls from people who hung up as soon as she answered. Most concerning, Several of her students reported being approached by strangers who asked detailed questions about their research activities. Hannah realized that her work had evolved beyond academic research into a form of activism that was making powerful people uncomfortable. But rather than being intimidated by these tactics, she found herself more determined than ever to continue uncovering hidden histories and advocating for proper recognition of unacknowledged innovators. She expanded the Anonymous Innovators Project into a formal research institute, securing funding from foundations and individual donors who supported the mission of documenting hidden contributions to technological development. The institute attracted researchers from around the world, creating an international network of scholars dedicated to identifying and acknowledging forgotten innovators. One of the institute's most ambitious projects involved creating a comprehensive database of classified contractors and their contributions, cross-referenced with patent filings and commercial applications that appeared to derive from their work. The database became an invaluable resource for historians, legal researchers, and policymakers working to reform intellectual property systems for classified work. But perhaps more importantly for Hannah personally, the Institute provided her with a platform to mentor young researchers who shared her passion for uncovering hidden stories. She established fellowship programs specifically for students from backgrounds that were underrepresented in academic research, recognizing that diverse perspectives were essential for identifying patterns that others de law might overlook. Jessica Park, the undergraduate student who had first asked about hidden histories, became the Institute's first full-time research coordinator after completing her degree. Under Hannah's mentorship, Jessica had developed into a skilled investigator whose work had contributed to several major discoveries about classified aerospace development during the 1990s. Professor Brooks changed my entire understanding of what engineering research could be, Jessica explained during a video interview for a documentary about Hannah's work. She taught me that the most important innovations often come from people who never appear in textbooks or receive awards, but whose work influences everything we use in our daily lives. That perspective has made me a better engineer and a better person." End quote. Hannah's influence extended far beyond her formal students and research collaborators. The publicity generated by her discoveries and advocacy work had inspired other people to investigate their own family histories, leading to dozens of additional cases of unrecognized classified contributors being identified and acknowledged. Support groups emerged for families of classified contractors, providing resources and advocacy for people seeking recognition or compensation for hidden contributions. The ripple effects of Hannah's work reached international levels when European researchers began applying similar investigative methods to their own historical records. The Anonymous Innovators Project established partnerships with universities and research institutes in 12 countries, creating a global movement dedicated to acknowledging hidden contributions to technological development. 5 years after opening her father's toolbox, Hannah received an invitation that represented the culmination of everything she had worked to achieve. The Nobel Committee for Economic Sciences asked her to present a special lecture about the economic impact of unrecognized innovation, acknowledging that her research had fundamentally changed understanding of how technological development actually occurs versus how it's officially documented. Standing before the distinguished audience in Stockholm, Hannah wore a necklace that incorporated the brass key her father had left her, now set in a custom pendant that also contained small pieces of metal from his career. Original Toolbox. The symbolism was intentional, representing how individual discoveries could unlock broader understanding that benefited entire societies. Ladies and gentlemen, Hannah began her lecture. When I inherited my father's truck 5 years ago, my family thought I had received worthless junk. What I actually inherited was evidence that our understanding of how innovation happens has been fundamentally incomplete. We have been measuring technological progress by looking only at the visible surface, ignoring the vast network of hidden contributors whose work makes that surface possible." End quote. Her lecture detailed the systematic patterns her research had uncovered, demonstrating that hidden innovation was not an occasional anomaly, but a fundamental characteristic of how technological development actually occurred. The economic implications were staggering, suggesting that traditional models of innovation and intellectual property needed to be completely reconsidered. My father's story taught me that the most valuable inheritances are often those that force us to question our assumptions about how the world works, Hannah continued. The rusted truck that seemed like a disappointment actually contained keys to understanding that innovation is far more collaborative and distributed than we have traditionally recognized. Following her lecture, Hannah was approached by representatives from major technology companies who wanted to discuss how her research findings might influence their own innovation strategies. She found it ironic that corporations that had benefited from appropriated classified research were now seeking her advice about how to properly acknowledge and compensate innovators. But Hannah's focus remained on education and advocacy rather than corporate consulting. She had learned from her father's example that the most meaningful work was often that which served broader purposes rather than immediate personal benefits. The Institute continued expanding its research programs and fellowship opportunities, creating pathways for young people from diverse backgrounds to contribute to uncovering hidden histories. Hannah also maintained her teaching responsibilities in MIT, though her courses had evolved to incorporate the ongoing discoveries being made by Institute researchers. Her classroom had become a dynamic environment where students worked on real investigations rather than simply studying historical cases, contributing to active research while developing their own skills and, quote, perspectives. One of her most successful courses, Engineering Justice, Recognizing Hidden Contributors to Technological Development, required students to identify and research a specific case of unacknowledged innovation, then present their findings to panels that included both academic researchers and policymakers. Many of these student projects led to formal recognition for previously unknown contributors, extending the impact of Hannah's work through the enthusiasm and dedication of her students. The course also attracted students from disciplines beyond engineering, including historians, economists, policy researchers, and journalists who recognized that understanding hidden innovation was crucial to their own fields. This interdisciplinary approach enriched the learning experience for everyone involved, while also broadening the scope of research being conducted through the Institute. As Hannah reflected on the journey that had begun with inheriting her father's truck, she realized that Frank Brooks's greatest gift to her had not been the specific materials in his toolbox, but rather the example he had provided of how to find meaning and purpose in work that might never receive public recognition. His decades of classified service had taught him that the most important contributions were often those that remained invisible to the outside world. Hannah had taken that lesson and transformed it into a mission of making the invisible visible, ensuring that hidden contributors received the recognition they deserved, while also changing how society understood the crass nature of innovation itself. The female mechanic who had once been mocked for inheriting junk had become a catalyst for recognizing that society's most valuable progress often comes from people whose contributions remain hidden beneath the surface of official histories.